introduce how we understand China's two major approaches to establishing its leading role in the global green transition. So first, discursive construction through state-owned medias and official narratives. And second session, so we'll delve into the strategic investment and industrial coordination across the clean tech supply chain of batteries and EVs, particularly in Indonesia. So in the first session, we have two speakers, Elena Ho. She is our non-resident research fellow at DSET. And also the second speaker is Elizabeth Frost. She is also a policy analyst on our team. And it is also our great pleasure to be joined by two distinguished discussants. First, Cheryl Yu. She is a fellow in China Studies at the Jamestown Foundation. She is the author of an upcoming report on Chinese Communist Party on united front groups in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and Germany. And she is also the co-author of Chinese Communist Party covered operations against Taiwan. So she is definitely the expert we go to when we wanted to know more about China's propaganda, especially with these United Front efforts. The second discussion, we're also joined by Nithin Coca. He is a Japan-based, Asia-focused, award-winning freelance journalist covering geopolitics, human rights, and sustainability across the region. And Nithin has reported extensively on climate issues and has paid close attention to China's climate messaging and propaganda in his recent works. So welcome to discussants. And today, just give you a brief run through the agenda. After our two speakers present their research findings together totaling about 50 minutes, I will invite each discussant to share their feedback and comments for 5 minutes. And Elena and Elizabeth will then respond before we open the floor to questions from the audience. And for our audience, thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Google form we share with you in advance through email, or you can find the link in the chat room right now. And as a final reminder to our speakers and discussants, today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to DSET's YouTube channel afterwards. So we kindly ask you to keep your cameras on throughout the first session. Thank you very much. Now, let us begin our first session with the two presentations. And first, let's welcome Elena, please.
Thank you, Tsai. As mentioned earlier, in this research report, we look at China's climate propaganda operation as a two-layer system. One is propaganda in words, where I'll be focusing on looking into the discursive construction, specifically through China's state media system. And my colleague Elizabeth Frost will be focusing on propaganda in action, where she will zoom in on how the government through state-sponsored actions can further help them form a self-reinforcing propaganda cycle to consolidate the global climate leadership perception. So as we know, China's growing influence and ambition in global climate action, particularly in the development of clean technologies, have attracted significant attention in recent years. So on China's green leadership, earlier this year, Xi Jinping has stated that however the world may change, China will not slow down its climate actions, will not reduce its support for international cooperation, and will not cease its efforts to build a community with a shared future for mankind. Many environmentalists, including those involved in the UN COP process, are increasingly seeing China as a climate leader, especially since the US has stepped back from the issue. And despite China has actively promoted itself as an indispensable, reliable, and responsible partner for the international community, these claims are increasingly contested. So China's emission reduction pledges remain insufficient, and it continues to position itself as a developing country within the United Nations in order to avoid stronger commitments that includes contribution to international climate finance. And then at the same time, China has faced criticism over continued BRI investment into coal, weaponizing climate negotiations as a response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, as well as domestic challenges where the rapid expansion of renewable energy has actually created human rights disputes issues or environmental and financial pressures at the local level. So rather than focusing solely on traditional security concerns or the technological aspects of China's renewable energy influence, The first session of this webinar will examine how China leveraged soft power to build a propaganda ecosystem that supports its pursuit of discursive power in the international climate space. We argue that China's propaganda operations on two interconnected levels. One is words and one is action. So as you can see on this chart, that discursive construction through state media narratives are oftentimes supported by systematic propaganda production and effective media framing, which lays the groundwork for shaping audience perceptions. These narratives are then reinforced through concrete actions that includes state-sponsored initiatives, Belt and Roads projects, and foreign direct investment. So such actions are subsequently framed by the media as successful case studies, which further strengthen the original narratives and are amplified through China's extensive propaganda system. And so together, these elements form a self-reinforcing cycle that expands China's discursive power in the climate domain. So a bit of the background of the very beginning of our research. More than a decade ago, Xi Jinping introduced the idea of telling China's story well at the National Propaganda and Ideology Work Conference. Since then, it has become a central slogan guiding China's external propaganda efforts. Xi has emphasized that telling China's story well is essential for strengthening China's international communication capacity and building its discourse power, particularly in shaping a more favorable external environment for China. And then more than 10 years later, after Xi Jinping first introduced the campaign slogan, telling China's story well, this messaging framework continues to shape China's propaganda strategy. So echoing this approach, Guo Weimin, who is the former Deputy Director General of the State Council Information Office, and who's also the current chairman of the China Public Relations Association, stated in an interview that environmental issues are challenges faced by the entire world. Strengthening international communication on ecological civilization, actively introducing China's policies, progress, and future approaches to the international community can create a favorable international public opinion environment and showcase the image of a responsible major country. So this makes it clear that telling China's story well has become an overarching propaganda framework. And then within this framework, environmental and climate issues have been identified as key strategic leverage points. And by promoting its climate policies and development achievements, the Chinese government is able to present a positive national image, and in doing so, probably further expand its influence in international politics. So to unpack how this influence is built and sustained, we need to take a closer look at how propaganda actually functions. So propaganda is a form of strategic communication with a clear purpose. It is to shape public's perceptions in ways that help an actor advance its agenda. And then over the past few decades, climate issues have apparently become increasingly important, especially in recent years. Responses to climate crisis and the push for renewable energy are no longer just environmental concerns. They are now central to national and international security discussions. So at the same time, as China has increasingly challenged US global leadership in several areas, and as the United States has stepped back from its role in climate leadership, it has actually created an opportunity for China to expand its influence on the global stage. While it is very important for us to recognize China's contribution to climate actions and renewable energy development, we think that it's also just as important to consider the broader implications. So China's growing prominence in the climate space can translate into geopolitical leverage, and its successful case studies of a top-down authoritarian approach to climate governments may be promoted and then potentially taken up as models by other countries. So then in our team, to understand how the Chinese government communicates through its propaganda, we looked at several major state-affiliated digital media outlets. That includes China Daily, Xinhua, Global Times, and China.org.cn. We searched for articles using keywords related to green energy technology, climate cooperation, critical minerals, as well as Taiwan and the One China principle. So in total, we analyzed 123 articles, 72 in Mandarin and 51 in English. What we found is that across both Mandarin and English reporting, China is consistently presented as an indispensable climate leader, particularly highlighting its achievements in green technology. This message shows up in both language and forms a shared baseline narrative. However, what we found interesting is that the way this message is communicated actually changes depending on the target audience. So for example, in Mandarin language reporting, which mainly targets domestic audiences and Chinese diasporas, the tone is more defensive. These articles tend to focus on reinforcing the government's legitimacy in renewable energy and climate action policy development, which often links to climate achievements to broader nationalist narratives. And then by contrast, English language reporting is more outward-facing and assertive and is often closely aligned with China's foreign policy priorities that includes anti-US framing and references to the One China principle. Another clear example of how China tailors state media messaging for different audiences can also be seen in its reporting on critical minerals. So in English language coverage, China seeks not only to reinforce its image as a pioneer in critical minerals development, but also to criticize the United States for refusing to collaborate while simultaneously claiming global leadership. And then on the contrary, Mandarin language reporting does not frame the issue primarily through the lens of US-China rivalry. Instead, it emphasizes that critical minerals are controlled by the states, echoing wider narratives about national sovereignty and government oversight. So the next slide that shows these are some of the examples that we have identified in the report. And you are more than welcome to, of course, read our report because we actually provide more detailed examples inside, along with clear explanation of how each example fits into our analytical categories. And these examples actually show how China constructs its climate narratives in words, but these narratives don't exist in isolation. To sustain credibility and visibility, these messages actually needs continuous reinforcement through real-world action that generate new content. So in the next section, my colleague Alizi, she will take us through how the Chinese government has put this propaganda into action.
Great, thank you, Elena. So after examining how China's green narratives are constructed through state media, the second strand of our research asks how these climate and energy narratives are communicated directly to global audiences through in-person engagement, most notably through organized trips to China. Our interest in this discussion was actually sparked by a discussion with one of our panelists, Nithin, who's very kindly joined us today. So in our interview with Nithin, he mentioned a delegation of Indonesian energy officials and think tank researchers who had previously attended a field trip to Shanxi province to study its energy transition away from coal. And as we look deeper into this case study, we thought it became a really compelling example of how Chinese climate and energy narratives move beyond just media discourse and translate into real-life influence. So this led us to focus the second component of our research into the role of climate and energy as themes of China's people-to-people exchanges. I want to preface this by saying that the research we conducted is intended as an exploratory study to identify some of the underlying patterns of these trips. With regards to our research approach, we conducted 2 interviews with US students who participated in trips themed around climate and energy earlier this year. We also carried out OSINT research, primarily using WeChat, to collect reporting and press releases related to these exchanges. In total, we identified 18 trips conducted between June 2024 and August 2025. Full details of all of these trips and our sources are available in the appendix of our report, as we suspect this number, only 18, represents only a partial picture. I will first outline how these trips are structured and the key actors involved, before discussing their impacts and why we believe there may be a risk that some exchanges move beyond legitimate engagement and function instead as part of an opaque influence campaign. In terms of participants, the trips target a wide range of people. Much like our 2 interviewees, one major cohort, pictured on the left, is US students, including those who actively study environmental-related subjects. This aligns closely with Xi Jinping's 2023 pledge to bring 50,000 American students to China over 5 years, a goal that is often explicitly referenced in the media reporting around these trips. Other participants, pictured on the right of the slide, frequently come from Belt and Road Initiative and Global South countries, including government officials, technical experts, NGO staff, journalists, social media influencers, etc., which we believe reflects Beijing's desire to build influence in regions of strategic interest. And just quickly, here is a map we put together, which identifies the US universities referenced as having students participate in these trips. So, what actually happens on these trips? Some trips are explicitly branded or themed around energy, sustainability, or climate governance topics, like the World Youth Energy Tour, pictured at the bottom right of this slide, or the Future Green Energy Leaders Summer Camp held by the University of Petroleum in Beijing for students from the US that was pictured on a previous slide. Other trips are framed as general cultural or educational exchanges to introduce participants to China, but still include curated visits to green energy and clean tech sites, showing how climate and energy narratives have become a key stream of China's international messaging. These site visits include trips to state-owned energy companies, like CHN Energy in the bottom right, low-carbon and eco-industrial zones, EV factories and showrooms, like the two pictures on the left-hand side, solar panel factories, and even some sites related to critical minerals, such as mining sites and even a lithium-themed museum in the top right of this slide, which we think shows how critical minerals, the topic of our second section today, are becoming embedded within China's green energy narratives. The selection of this site also suggests that China's focus is on issues that benefit its green tech export economy. So here we lay out the China-based organizations that we identified through our OSINT research as involved in these tours, whether by acting as hosts, organizers, sponsors, or sending officials to participate. These organizations include government bodies and CCP-aligned organizations at the national, provincial, and city levels, alongside universities, research institutions, media, and industry, reflecting what we see as a whole-of-society approach to promoting China's green narratives. The organizations marked by an asterisk on this slide, I appreciate it's quite small, so if you would like to see a clearer picture, please refer to the report. So the organizations marked by an asterisk are explicitly part of the CCP or directly managed by party bodies, such as the All China Youth Federation, the Foreign Affairs Office of the CCP Changsha Municipal Committee, and the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, a bit of a mouthful, which is an organization I will talk more about shortly. However, because of the party's embeddedness across Chinese institutions, it is likely that the CCP influence extends beyond these entities. Something else we wanted to point out to everyone is how we also identified in the report several international NGOs named in official reporting as co-organizers of these trips. Our working hypothesis is that their primary role lies in recruiting international participants and helping to facilitate activities on the ground. While these organizations all present themselves as independent and are all headquartered overseas, from their websites and from our research, they all appear to maintain close ties with China. In several cases, we found that they collaborate directly with the Chinese government bodies on reports and policy recommendations, suggesting longer-term structured engagement rather than ad hoc one-off cooperation. Now, I want to zoom in on one of these organizations in particular, the China United States Exchange Foundation, or CUSEF. Although CUSEF describes itself online as an independent platform, it is directly managed by the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, an organization widely established as being part of the CCP's United Front system. This raises concerns that the exchanges CUSEF organizes may be designed to advance United Front objectives, which include, according to the US Select Committee on the CCP, unifying with Taiwan and establishing a new global order that revolves around CCP values and interests. As Cheryl, another one of our panelists today, has noted in her work for the Jamestown Foundation, many of CUSEF's private donors also have ties to United Front entities. These connections have triggered growing concern in the United States. Just last month, the US House Select Committee on the CCP sent a letter to Columbia University regarding a student exchange co-sponsored by CUSEF, urging the university to discontinue exchange programs supported by organizations linked to the CCP, and explicitly citing evidence of CUSEF's role within the United Front system. For us, this serves as evidence that in some cases, climate change and green energy are used as themes in trips that may not be legitimate exchanges, but could be linked to broader United Front efforts to influence public opinion in line with the CCP's strategic goals. Now, let's discuss the impacts of these trips on participants' perceptions of China. While these observations are based only on our 2 interviews with student participants, they nonetheless shed light on how citizen diplomacy programs support the Chinese government's efforts to build soft power and influence public opinion. First, the inclusion of climate and energy themes was a key factor motivating some participants to apply to take part in these trips. This suggests that China's green leadership narratives are effective in generating international interest and that climate and sustainability function as relatively safe or appealing entry points for engagement, particularly with younger audiences. Second, our interviewees had direct interactions with government officials and were subject to intensive state media coverage during the trip, a pattern that we have observed and identified across all of the trips we analyzed in our OSINT research. Yet, despite this, our interviewees were actually largely unaware of the central role played by the Chinese government and associated organizations in organizing the trips, as the primary organizing body, in this case CUSEF, presented itself as independent. This illustrates how NGO intermediaries can effectively obscure state involvement from participants. Third, one interviewee recalled narratives emphasizing that China is doing a lot on climate change and that China is actively supporting other developing countries. Overall, our interviewees reported more positive perceptions of China after the trip, indicating that these exchanges are effective in shaping favorable views of China's climate and energy actions. From another perspective, going back to Elena's earlier conceptualization of China's discursive power cycle, these trips also serve a domestic propaganda function. Chinese media coverage of these exchanges often highlights praise from foreign participants, presumably intended to further legitimate and solidify the CCP's political legitimacy to the Chinese public. I will now just quickly summarize our key takeaways from this section of the report. First, I hope through my presentation and Elena's presentation and through the report in total that we've demonstrated understanding propaganda matters, as it helps us to better understand the aims of authoritarian governments and how they seek to influence public opinion. Secondly, through our research, we've established that climate change and green energy are now core narratives in China's propaganda, both in words and in action. Third, through our investigation into climate and energy-related trips, we've established there is a whole of society approach to promoting China's green leadership narratives. And finally, international NGOs play a key role in this ecosystem, with examples of long-term collaboration and deeper engagement with Chinese governmental institutions. So based on all of this, our suggested ways forward emphasize the importance of greater transparency, which we believe requires continued monitoring and tracking of China's climate propaganda, its soft power initiatives, and their impacts on public opinion in order to help us better understand the potential risks. Okay, this concludes the propaganda section of our report. Thank you everyone for tuning in today and for your time. Please do read the full report. It's now live on our website, and I'm very excited to hear the feedback and the sharing from our panelists. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elena and Lizzie. Right now, I would like to invite Cheryl. Would you please also share your feedbacks or any comments or any questions to our this report? Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me here. And also congratulations to the authors on the publication of this report. I think it's great to see that the PRC's climate engagement analyzed not just as a policy cooperation, but as political and also strategic activity. And so I want to highlight 3 findings from the report that stood out to me, particularly from a United Front perspective, because this changed how we should interpret climate engagement with the PRC. So first, the report makes clear that climate-related engagement has been incorporated into the CCP's United Front toolkit. I think the report notes, and also the authors have mentioned in their presentation, organizations such as CPA, FFC, or QCEF, the China-US Exchange Foundation, have integrated climate-related topics directly into the United Front efforts. And I think climate has become part of the PRC's international propaganda precisely because it is widely viewed as collaborative rather than confrontational. United Front's work is about cultivating friends and building relationships the party can exploit to advance its objectives when necessary. And as Elena mentioned, the objective eventually is about becoming the dominant power in the international order. So from that perspective, a lot of every topic, including climate, no matter how innocent it looks, it can be used as a way for the party to carry out its United Front work. An issue that appear benign or universally supported, whether it's climate, sports, culture, they can all serve as an entry point for the party to build relationship. And climate is particularly effective in this regard because it lowers defenses. Engagement appears technical, ethical, and also forward-looking. So as the report shows, those climate-themed trips and exchanges have been effective in shaping participants' perceptions of the PRC as a constructive climate partner and also an emerging leader. And I think that's exactly what the party's United Front work is trying to do. So use climate as a very attractive topic to invite participants in, and then make sure that they build relationship with these participants, and then also make sure that they convey their messages, and which all goes back to supporting the party's ultimate goal, which is to become the global leader in the world stage. And my second point is that although climate may feel new as an issue area, the way the party operates here is not new. The report shows that the party activates this same overseas United Front network that they are using across all issue area for climate instead of building a new one. So my forthcoming report maps more than 2,000 organizations across 4 democratic countries, including in the United States, that form the party's overseas United Front network. And the report, the Green Ambitions report, shows exactly how this same large network is now being functionally activated in the climate domain. So for example, one of the organizations that Lizzie just mentioned is the Oregon China Council. That organization, we identify it as a United Front organization based in the US, in the United States. And this organization, and also its affiliated individuals, they not only organize climate-related trips, but they also say, for example, push state governments to pass resolutions encouraging Chinese language study by promoting establishment of Confucius classroom in Oregon public universities, public schools. They also try to make, sister city relationship or sister state relationship for the PRC, and they also try to strengthen ties for the PRC with the state. And so I think this illustrates how a single organization can operate across climate, education, and subnational diplomacy. And this is exactly how the party expects its overseas United Front network to work, which is to move across different issue areas while relying on the same underlying relationship and organizational infrastructure. And finally, I want to mention that I really like the hierarchy graphic that shows the PRC actors involved in organizing climate tours. It's really nicely laid out, and it's very, it enforces a core United Front principle, which is that United Front work is the work of the entire party state. This is what the party has been saying, which is that United Front work is the work of the whole party. So every government agency, company, and affiliated organization is a tool of the party and has the responsibility to carry out United Front activities. And the graphic nicely showed exactly that. So every government, government agencies at every level, national level, provincial level, city level, and also companies like State Grid and other organizations or industries are involved in organizing those climate-related trips. And I think that helps explain the scale and persistence of these efforts, even in domains like climate that are often assumed to be apolitical. So taken together, I think this report shows that climate engagement should not be understood only as cooperation. It is also a space where influence is exercised. And challenge for democratic state is not whether to engage on climate, but how to do so with a clear-eyed understanding of the party's intention and methods. And I think I'll stop here. I hope I did not go over time, but yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Valuable feedback, better than us. So it's really, we really appreciate that. Thank you. And now I would like to ask Nithin, would you also please share your feedback with us? Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you. Great work on this report. I think this is super valuable for people like me who are not China experts, but really see these types of propaganda, these influence operations happening in places like Indonesia all the time. And to kind of be able to understand how these are part of a broader interconnected strategy, I think really is helpful to making these kind of connections and also better understanding like what China is actually trying to accomplish in the region. So really great. And I hope really look forward to seeing further research to better kind of understand how this is happening in places like Southeast Asia, which is a really important part of the world. I guess just some thoughts unlike I think the other panelists today, I'm not a China expert and I'm not covering China directly, but I'm looking really things from a regional perspective. So I'm looking at things from outside China. And I cover human rights and climate primarily in East and Southeast Asia. And it really strikes me when I cover this issue, how China is really perceived like two different countries in these two different spaces. So how, in the human rights space, China's seen with a lot of distrust, country that's not, arresting journalists, activists, and also overtly or indirectly supporting authoritarian-minded regimes in places like Myanmar and Cambodia. And you don't, there's very little trust of data, or, you have to be skeptical of what China says in those spaces. But in the climate space, it's completely different. It's China is seen as a leader. It's seen as a potential partner, a counterweight to the United States, a hope for the world, a country that's led by, I hear this often, science-led policy, which I think this report really shows that it's not necessarily science-led policy. There's a lot more behind their propaganda and influence efforts. Shows a quite different perspective. And I think that's important because they can push back on that idea. And I think there's a great, much greater willingness of people to partner with China on the climate space than on other spaces because they perceive China as a trustful partner. And that, I think, impacts their ability to, have influence in the region. So, yeah, I think this also reminded me of something that just happened at COP30 in Brazil last month. So at COP30, there was a really strong push led by civil society, but also African and Latin American delegations to include critical minerals in the Just Transition Work Program. And that would, encompass things like human rights for workers along the critical mineral supply chain. That effort failed because China, backed by only one other country, and I'll let everyone guess what country that was, opposed it. And now at the end of COP30, the joint Just Transition Work Program has no reference to critical minerals at all. This is a major glaring gap. But what was most interesting to me was the civil society reaction. Because here was a super clear example of the Chinese government opposing something championed by the global South, a region that China often claims to represent, especially in the climate space. And it was also an issue seen as crucial, the just transition to many climate activists. Despite this, the criticism of China was very, very muted. And I just imagine, what if this was the United States or Japan or a European country that has stood or blocked this type of effort? I feel like the outcry would be far greater. So why is it that China is treated so differently when they take these types of actions in climate diplomacy space? And I think this report helps us begin to understand why China is able to do things or act in ways that are quite contradictory. So it's in just a few minutes. So I want to end with a couple of questions I had for future research and things that I'm curious about as a journalist. And I think that, questions I got while looking at this report. So the report, really clearly documents the role of international NGOs. And you mentioned several in China's green diplomacy push. I'm really curious if those NGOs or the partners they're working with in places like Indonesia, is there more of an official relationship or a financial relationship? Is it beyond just being invited on tours? Is there something more going on? And I think we've seen this a lot in the media space, where a lot of media outlets in Africa and in parts of Southeast Asia are getting funding from the Chinese government. And that's one reason they're putting pro-Chinese messages. So I'm curious is this also happening in the climate space? And is that one reason we're seeing this take place? And how do we uncover that? The second question I always have is the reliability of data about Chinese climate and clean energy action. Because I've been told in other spaces, quite often, if you look at Chinese data on the economy or trade, it's not very trustworthy. So is the data on climate and clean energy trustworthy? And if so, like, if it is trustworthy, why? And if not, what story are they trying to push through the use of data? And then I think an issue that's going to become a lot bigger and maybe a place to push back on China more is around clean tech technology transfer. So how willing is China to actually share technology with partners in places like Southeast Asia? And you're seeing countries kind of push for that because they don't want to just be destinations for solar panels and electric vehicles. They want to be part of the process. And China has, been because it's part of the national security strategy, they're not willing to transfer technology in the same way that the countries want. So this might be an opportunity, a place, I think, for countries like Japan, Taiwan, or Europe to counter Chinese influence by being able to actually provide technology transfers and kind of show and maybe like be able to invest in different ways. And that might be one area where you'll see, I think, a lot of concerns from countries in the region going forward. And maybe lastly, like there's very little knowledge or kind of understanding of mining and clean energy developments within China, as particularly in places like Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. I think Tibet is 85% of Chinese domestic lithium production, and you don't really hear about kind of human rights issues in that space. And how are they linked to global supply chains and investment as well? Because there might be a lot of linkages that are not being well understood. So I'll end there. Those are questions, and again, a really valuable report. I think I'll be very useful for me in my research and reporting across the region in the future. Okay, you're muted still.
Yeah, so right now I think I will ask my presenters to also respond to them, and maybe we can also have some follow-up questions with Cheryl again, because I'm really curious about your report coming out, and you cover all other regions as well. So we are very curious about that. So firstly, I think I will ask Lizzie to please answer the question that Nithin raised about, so what's the actual international NGOs engagement in these trips, and how do we identify these links to CCPs in general? And do we see actual, like, for example, what Nithin just said about other fundings that's actually help to initiate for the collaboration between China and other countries? So please, Lizzie.
Sure, thank you, Nithin. As I mentioned at the beginning, our report is aimed to be an exploratory report. So we're really hoping to continue this research, either within DSET or also working with external partners to really dig into this. Because this is exactly a question we had as well, right? So you'll notice in the language of our report, we're very careful just to identify these NGOs and just point out these links without really kind of making any assertions about the actual relationship with China. And so I think I would really be interested in hearing from Cheryl and her research and how her team has managed to kind of really solidify these connections in a moment. I think from the observations we made, it does seem like these relationships are ongoing. It's not just a case of, seeing a opportunity to have a trip, but actually continued engagement through, for example, co-authoring policy reports or making policy suggestions, or even in some cases sponsoring scholarships for students from, for example, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, to come to China to learn how to become clean tech engineers, etc. So it seems like these relationships do go beyond potentially just a one-off financial exchange. But yeah, I think this is something we would really like to dig into much more. And I think what we also noticed is all of the organizations we identified, despite being based in the US, in Hong Kong, in the Philippines, all of the founders are Chinese, which isn't necessarily indicative of anything directly, but it shows that maybe deeper connection with China there as well. And also some of them have, they all have bilingual Chinese-English websites, I believe, and often have kind of like different names in English and Mandarin. So the English name will, in one case, for example, will sound kind of more just generic and about climate focused, whereas the Mandarin name will have a much more kind of specific link to China in it. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing from Cheryl about how we can take this research further to kind of dig into any potential deeper relationships there. I also wanted to touch on Nithin's point about technology transfer to Southeast Asia. I think this is something we look at a little bit in the second chapter of the report about how, especially thanks to Indonesia's downstreaming efforts, there has been some seeming like transfer of technology or moving higher up the value chain within Indonesia. But as we point out, that's not necessarily the whole picture, and a lot of this is still kind of very dependent on China and Chinese investment and Chinese knowledge. So I hope we can kind of come back to this conversation in the second section as well. So yeah, Cheryl, I don't know if you had anything to add on that point about how we can really dig into these relationships between the international NGOs and the CCP or the Chinese state.
So wait, I do have like one follow-up questions for the report. So which is like on the participants. Is there any follow-up that from your research that you observed that like, I'm not sure if like the participants mention anything of like the CCP's follow-up after their trip coming back from the PRC? Just curious because since they're trying to, like using the trip as a initial engagement method, I'm just curious if there's any like long-term thing that you guys observed during the interviews.
Okay. Lizzie, you wanted to add more about that?
Yeah, and I think Elena can also jump in on
Yes.
that. I believe in the case of interviews and also some of the other research I did, that it was quite often followed up with like a meeting back in the, particularly in the US, back in the home country to kind of reflect on these tours. But I think Elena might have some more to add on that.
Yeah, please, Elena.
I think in the report we have mentioned that after the trip, they have been invited to a closed-door meeting. Just the representative in the Chinese representative in the US, they invited those participants to a closed-door meeting to talk about their experience. So that's what we got from the interviewees.
And sure, if I may, I mean, because when we're doing all these research and doing all these interviews, we also identify some, like Lizzie just said, this is not just a one-time climate tour, right? So after that, we often see like these NGOs that actually help to invite all these think tankers to the trip, and then we'll also write up follow-up policy reports and to assess, maybe sometimes that's not actually, they will also provide some critical point of view regarding, China's real developments there about the transition, but still we can see that how NGO act as bridges as we identify in the slide, right? So they are actually building this relationship for further engagement with the local, either it's think tanks or other officials, government officials even, and also for the students, as you already point out in your report as well. They will have scholarship follow-up and other kind of person-to-person exchange as well. So, but Cheryl, please, if you have anything you wanted to.
I think if it's to talk about observing the Chinese organizations and also overseas organization, the thing that I would look at, and I think you guys probably, I think in your report you already touched on that, which is to look at the leadership of the organization, which I think Lizzie just mentioned, and also specifically the funders, like who is funding those organizations, and whether there is like, if the organization leadership has participated in any like direct engagement with United Front system, and that the United Front system, it's pretty large, right? It's not just like CPA-FFC or QSEF. It's also like some other ones like Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, which is now part of the United Front Department, United Front Work Department, and some other central, actually I think there are central affiliated organization, United Front organizations as a start. And I think that is just like the central ones are just the main part. There's also like provincial level, the same organizations also like CPA-FFC also has like provincial level organizations and some other ones. So I think the main thing to keep or to like identify whether those organizations are United Front affiliated, or if those like say climate trips or the event is problematic, I think the first thing would be to look at their who is backing the trip, who is leading it, and also like sometimes by their statements, like a lot of times they would parrot CCP narratives and messages to their greater audience. I think that would be another thing to look at.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. So I mean, for Nithin's other questions about the mining problems in China on their own soil, I think this is really another good point to show and to exemplify that why China is not telling the whole story, right? They are telling a very good story about themselves, but not the whole picture. And this is why we think it is also very important to flag that to the audience and to the reader and to all these participants engaged with all these trips. And that's why I think both us, your coverage stories and also this report, why these are important. And I hope that Nithin, you can join and stay with us the second session, because like you said, we will talk more about the critical mining issues in Indonesia as well. And because I also wanted to ask our audience, if you can also ask questions through the Google Forms, and I will pick up some of the questions to our panelists today. And now I have actually one question from Art. Thank you, Art, for joining us today. So the first one is Art wanted to ask Nithin. Her question is, why, Nithin, you believe China is able to act in contradictory ways in the climate change space? So this is the first question, go to Nithin. And the second question, sorry, Nithin, I will just say all these questions out and then I will give the floor to you. So, and the second question is about, so also from Art, if China were a democracy, okay, and these efforts might be described as a soft power, of course. And so beyond shaping favorable perception of China, what broader effects does China's climate-related propaganda have? So this question, I think I will ask my two presenters to respond. But first, Nithin, would you please?
Yeah, maybe just like I've done some reporting kind of on how civil society groups are influenced by China in the past. So I think one of the reasons is that a lot of international NGOs, civil society NGOs, environmental climate NGOs have offices in China. So they're quite limited in speaking out against China because their staff in China can face pressures or threats directly. And there's been, I think, several documented cases that I know of where like an international affiliate of another office had done something and the Chinese office had the police show up and had to be silenced. So there's like that works. The second concern is I think the second issue is like, because it's really impossible for civil society actors to actually campaign in China, they often just ignore it or don't focus on it because there's no way to do like direct advocacy, grassroots advocacy, or even like media outreach in the same way they can in democratic countries. So quite often I think for a lot of civil society groups, there's just like a limited understanding or ability to operate in China because of those constraints. And that's why when they have like limited budget, they decide, let's focus on the US, let's focus on Japan. But I think like what this report is, what I'm curious about, there's like a third group of groups that too often are parroting like Chinese propaganda messages that are quite similar to what the government puts out. And I'm curious about the role of those organizations that are more proactively like promoting China's message around the world, and why they're taking that approach. But I think the lack of criticism is kind of a structural issue. And I think I've had discussions with people in some of these groups, and quite often they want to work on China, but they don't know how to. And because it's so difficult, they often decide, okay, we have a limited budget, let's do Japan campaigns instead. Or let's focus on Indonesia instead, because we can do something there, but we can't really do anything in China. So there's a lot of factors at play, but I think it's part just inability and part, I think there is more to it, and that's what I'm more curious about, like what's the other side, what's going on. I think the report is trying to shed some light on that.
That is a very informative answer. And now I will ask maybe Alina, you can go first, and then Lizzie, you can add some further points to the second question.
Would you mind rephrasing it again? Sorry, I was really caught in Nathan's response.
Of course, of course. So the second question is about also from Art from the British office in Taipei. If China were a democracy, which we also talked about this before. If China were a democracy, these efforts we would saw them as a soft power approach, and then this is probably a very good thing to do. So beyond shaping favorable perceptions of China, what broader effects does China's climate-related propaganda have? So, Alina.
Yeah, so on top of my head, what I was just thinking about, like what I mentioned in my part, and then also in the report, the authoritarian issues, like that piece of how it actually demonstrates like these models actually work, is I think a really alarming signal for most countries. And also we have presented in our report really clearly how, like, for example, for Taiwan, like, as a Taiwanese, like for us, what does that mean, the implication of it? Like we have clearly laid out in the report how usually China's like the so-called climate actions, like how they're collaborating with the developing countries is always string attached. And then like in some cases we identify string attached related to Taiwan's like the so-called One China principle. So yes, I think just short answer to this question is the authoritarian issues.
Yeah, and Lizzie.
Yeah, if I can just add to what Elena said, I think the section Elena is talking about, for those of you who have the report open, is page 35 onwards. We have a section on the risks of China's climate propaganda. So one idea, the kind of our first argument that Elena just mentioned is this idea that as an authoritarian country, by promoting its approach as, incredibly successful, not focusing on any of the kind of negative sides, we think this is a risk of kind of promoting China's top-down authoritarian government model and potentially even exporting it to other countries as the most successful form of climate governance in comparison to, for example, protest or direct advocacy. The second risk we identify is that this positive propaganda efforts could create the impression that there is no alternative to China if the world is to succeed in successfully combating climate change. And this is also being kind of advanced by the recent step back of the US from the climate space. And we believe this does have implications for Taiwan specifically. So as part of our research into the media narratives, we did find several examples of where the One China policy, or kind of specifically about Taiwan, was connected to or mentioned in very close proximity to China's willingness to work with partner countries on climate change. And we've also got a table on page 39, which looks at several of the countries that have switched recognition from Taiwan to the PRC in the last 10 years or so, and identified that actually they are generally countries that are very vulnerable to climate change, and that there have been direct examples of climate collaboration with China since that recognition switch. So we see this as an issue where, if China is presented as the global leader with the most successful model, this could have direct implications for Taiwan diplomatically. And then I also just wanted to point out, I think part of what we were looking at, especially by identifying these links with the United Front issues, and I think Cheryl really clarified that very well for us, is that although climate change and green energy topics are incredibly important, and we do need to, the world as a whole needs to continue to work with China on this. By identifying these specific links with the United Front, it shows that it's not just about developing soft power, but also specifically about advancing United Front goals, which obviously include particular repercussions for Taiwan as well. So yeah, I hope I've explained that clearly, but everything is hopefully laid out more cogently in the report. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, and Cheryl, if you want to also give us maybe one sentence of feedback regarding the broader engagement, the implication you think from all these United Front efforts.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of so I think the PRC is trying to tell the rest of the the world that there's a Chinese option in as opposed to a democratic one. So I think it's also like trying to offer this authoritarian regime as the the only option that other countries can work with them on.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl, for that. So that concludes our first session. I will ask all our discussants and our presenters to stay freeze and smile because we wanted to catch this very special moment with a screenshot from our PR team colleagues. So please, everyone, smile to the screen, although it's real, but let's try it for like 5 minutes. 5 seconds. 5 seconds we will do. Okay, so okay, good. Good. So thank you all for joining us the first session. And now we will take a short 10 minutes break before proceeding to the second session. So please be back at 11:05 Taipei time, and we will start on time. Thank you again, Cheryl and Nithin. I really appreciate all these feedbacks and questions you gave us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, no, he just joined.
Okay. Okay, so we are 1 minute away. Alvin, Ian, and Angela, would you please also turn on your camera? Good. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. So glad to see you all. Good, good, good. So we are 1 minute away, and then we'll start. Hey, good. Welcome back. We now move to the second session of our report launch event today. In this session, we will delve into China's strategic investments in the clean tech supply chain with a particular focus on the national strategy to develop batteries and electric vehicles by securing Indonesia's nickel mining industry. We have an excellent lineup for this session as well. Our speaker is Yiting Ran. She is the policy analyst on my team, and we are joined by 3 expert discussants today. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Alvin Camba. He is the director of research and lead scientist at Lyvi, an AI company focused on risk assessment, supply chains, and investment analysis for critical resources and strategic industries. And he is also a senior adjunct scientist at Associated Universities Inc., where he is part of the Beacons project, which is also very key and important for us. We also want to learn a lot. This Beacons project is an initiative funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, which is dedicated to building U.S. battery capacity and strengthening downstream critical mineral supply chains. Dr. Camba has shared many insights with us and has helped shape this report from the very beginning stage. So thank you for joining us today. I look forward to your comment later. Second, we have Dr. Angela Tritto, Honorary Fellow at University College London's European International Social and Political Studies Center. She was formerly with the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, where her research focused on China's Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia and beyond. Belt and Road Initiative is also another very key policy and also the framework that we analyze in our report, and we see how this turned into a green Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia and what's the implication. So I really keen and wanted to hear your feedback and observation about this. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ian Satchwell. Ian is a senior advisor for minerals at the Asian-US Partnership Program, and also as an adjunct professor at the Sustainable Minerals Institute of the University of Queensland. He has more than 3 decades of experiences across minerals and energy, investment and trade, regional economic development and infrastructure in Northern Australia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We have consistently learned a great deal from Ian's insights in every exchange we've ever had. So of course, this time will also be the case. So this session will begin with also a 15-minute presentation by Yiting. And then I will invite each discussant to share their comments for 5 minutes, followed by Yiting's response before we open the floor to questions from the audience. So for our audience, if you have any questions, again, please submit them via the Google form we shared by email or to the link available in the chat room right now. And again, the final reminder that today's webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to DSET's YouTube channel afterward. So we kindly ask our speakers and discussants to keep their cameras on throughout the whole session. Thank you very much. Now, let us kick off the second session of the presentation. So Yiting, please.
Okay. Thank everyone for attending today's webinar. During the previous session, we learned about the climate approach to climate propaganda, a China approach to climate propaganda, and its ambition to become a climate leader in recent years. And in this session, I would like to go back to the upstream of the clean tech supply chain to examine how China dominates key minerals for production needs through overseas investment. And our team also takes the Indonesian nickel industry as a case study for this issue. So everyone knows that China has shifted toward high-tech industry after it published the Made in China 2025 plan. And afterward, China has also recognized mineral supply security as a national security issue in its 5-year plan, prioritizing control over upstream resource for high-tech manufacturing. And this increased demand for mineral in clean tech is not just happening in China. This graph shows that EV and battery storage will account for about half the mineral demand growth over the next 2 decades. And this figure further underscores the growing demand for specific mineral needed for clean tech. I want to note that the gross demand rate for mineral vital for battery manufacturing, such as lithium, cobalt, and nickel. Of course, China cannot extract all this mineral from its own land and still relies on other mining countries for raw material and ores to satisfy its manufacturing needs. As you can see, the right-hand side shows China's dominance in critical mineral refining, while the left-hand side displayed China's share of the primary production of the raw material. And we can see China is still relied on other countries for raw materials. I want to draw your attention to the last mineral on the bottom, nickel, because nickel is a vital mineral for EV battery production. And you can see that while China produces very little nickel, it controls a much larger share of global refining capacity. So where is the nickel coming from? Indonesia has the world's largest nickel reserve, accounting for 22% of the global reserves. And China, in order to secure stable supplies of critical mineral for clean tech, turns its foreign direct investment focus on resource-rich countries like Indonesia. And this began at the launch of the BRI in 2013, when China's FDI in metal sector underwent a major geographical change. As you can see in the left-hand chart, China's FDI in Indonesia represents 16% of China's total FDI in metal sector. And when other countries seek access to its abundant reserves, Indonesia also takes steps to protect its resource. And so since 2009, Indonesia has introduced multiple mineral policy to maximize resource revenue and driving industrial upgrading. Its core strategy include nickel ore export bans and downstream investment requirements to force higher value production inside Indonesia. And the goal of this policy was to control market access while still offering foreign investors a predictable environment for investment. Afterward, we can see Indonesia rapidly shifted away from raw ore export to onshore smelting, refining, and battery production. Indonesia successfully built up its domestic nickel refining capacity. However, this downstream incentive also triggered a surge of Chinese-led joint ventures flowing into the Indonesia industrial park. And it's estimated around 40% of Indonesia nickel refining capacity is concentrated in industrial parks where Chinese companies control majority ownership stakes. I'm sorry. Okay. And so why did Chinese company ended up controlling majority stakes in industrial park? What we found is that Chinese overseas financing closely tracks the timeline of the BRI. This chart breaks down the China's mineral lending portfolio. The dark green portion represents the lending from Chinese policy bank, while the orange portion comes from commercial banks. We can see that before the launch of the BRI in 2013, China's policy banks dominate around 90% of the outbound mineral financing. Then in the early BRI period, the role of the policy bank declined and commercial bank expanded. And then Eventually, in 2018 to 2021, commercial bank ended up providing around 74% of overseas financing in mineral sector, and policy banks fell to around 14%. Sorry. And this transition from policy bank to commercial banks reflects China's changing strategy and explain how Chinese bank financing moved in step with its company overseas expansion, allowing them to secure majority stakes in the Indonesian nickel supply chain. And this is another figure that demonstrates how China still found a way to access resources and markets. Overall, we can see how Chinese overseas financing works. In the very initial phase, Chinese policy bank mainly supports Chinese state-owned enterprise, those SOE, by lowering the entry barrier of mining investment. They will fund large-scale mining and construction projects and support Chinese company by lowering the entry cost. And then commercial banks will follow up with the company that have gradually built up capital and overseas capacity. This shift was tied to a new pattern, which we call the policy paving the way and commercial follow-up. That means commercial banks provide syndicated lending and continue to support Chinese firms that have hold capital in Indonesia to keep expanding. This also led to more financing for smaller projects in industrial parks and non-mining Chinese firms entering Indonesia. At the same time, Chinese companies can contribute their own equity capital to joint venture with local SOEs and to secure resources, secure majority stakes in the supply chain. So what does it mean Chinese commercial bank help these firms expand in the supply chain? Now I will turn to a case study in the Indonesia Morowali Industrial Park to explain how Chinese firms dominate a massive share of the industrial park. INIP was evaluated as a flagship project under the BRI. Following the Indonesia oil export ban, China nickel mining and refining giant Tsingshan Group emerged as a major investor in INIP. And in the first phase, INIP mainly produced stainless steel and nickel pig iron, which is a low-grade and not valuable material. And then in the second phase, a joint venture called QNB New Energy Material was established by Chinese and non-Chinese shareholders, including Tsingshan Group, GM, and CATL subsidiaries from Recycling. This joint venture focused on producing an intermediate material, NHP, that can be further processed into a nickel chemical for EV battery. And in the third phase, we can see even a deeper integration of a nickel supply chain. The most notable development is the joint construction of a high-pressure acid leach plant, which is critical for producing battery-grade intermediate materials. And taking these three phases together, this illustrates how Chinese investment has leveraged its nickel refining capacity into a deeper integration across battery-grade nickel chemicals and EV battery manufacturing. And this model is no longer limited to INIP. Similar investment patterns are now visible in other industrial parks, such as Weda Bay Industrial Park and Pomala Industrial Park, where China is embedding processing know-how and market access across multiple sites. So our main takeaway from this case study is to show while Indonesia can leverage through export ban and downstreaming rules, it remains tied to China capital, technology, and market demand. Both actors relied on each other, but Indonesia depends apparently more heavily on Chinese firms, creating a structured leverage through asymmetric interdependence. For example, INIP still exports intermediate products and remain dependent on the Chinese buyer. Additionally, even though the smelting and refining occur in Indonesia, study reveals that Chinese companies control 75% of shareholding, and while while Indonesia firms only have about 13%. Moreover, it's estimated that over 90% of Indonesian nickel products exports were shipped back to China. And this in turn has created several economic and political impact due to the reliance on China. China is right now Indonesia's largest FDI source, especially in energy, mining, and construction sectors. In Indonesia, leadership view Chinese investment favorably, but some critics are concerned about over-reliance on China, stating that Indonesia only captured less than 10% of the added value. Not to mention, Indonesia itself carries the biggest burden of the social and environmental impact, such as a refining plant, waste, accidents, and labor issue. So this is a brief summary of what I just explained, but our key message is that policymakers need to be aware of the risk of over-reliance on China. Even if Chinese investment remains the most appealing economy choice. At the same time, Indonesia still have policy in place that make it open to other foreign investment. Although Chinese currently dominate a lot of these joint ventures and partnership in its industrial park, we can see that there are concerns about its massive share and the associated consequence. And it would be great if there were more and more case studies to examine how Chinese overseas investment in mining country reveals a greater variety of asymmetric dependence pattern. The above is my presentation for our latest report. Thanks everyone's attention and look forward to having more discussion with our distinguished panelists. And they are all the experts on this topic will provide everyone with more valuable insights. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Yiting. So very well summarizing all the second part of our report, which we're trying to identify that China is wanting to dominate or to reach its goal as a leader of the green transition of the world. Then China itself need to secure the whole supply chain of clean tech, which also includes the investments in critical minerals, which we see as very key issues right now as they are weaponizing critical minerals as leverage to any kind of trade deals or political negotiations. So now I will turn to our very wonderful lineup of our discussants. Firstly, I would like to invite maybe Alvin. Would you also please share some of your feedback and maybe some questions for this report, and we will try to answer. Please.
Yeah, that sounds good, but I have a presentation. I actually sent it. I don't know if you all got it.
Like yes, I got it. And now we'll share the slides for you.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Yeah, I'll just tell you when to move.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not gonna introduce myself. Thank you, DSET team, for this report. It makes a genuinely important contribution to how we understand China, climate change, and critical minerals. And generally speaking, I'll be super clear. The report demonstrates that China's green transition produces asymmetric interdependence. To me, that was like the most important point that sort of like is connected to my research. Host countries become dependent on Chinese capital, technology, and markets in ways that are difficult to unwind. Now, everything I say basically everything I say builds directly on that finding. My contribution then is to show how this asymmetric interdependence is produced politically through elite alignment, institutional embedding, and sacrifice zones, rather than treating it as a purely economic or political outcome. Next slide, please. Yeah, next. And so Indonesia for me is the clearest illustration of the report's argument. Wonderful that you focus on that country. As the report shows, Indonesia successfully forced nickel processing onshore through export bans and downstreaming. Raw overseas exports declined, domestic processing expanded, and industrial capacity grew. This is obviously an industrial achievement. The report also shows a paradox. Even as processing is localized, asymmetric interdependence persisted. Chinese firms retain control over capital, technology, financing, offtake agreements, and final markets. The value chain continued to bend back towards China. In other words, if I'm going to summarize what this means, downstreaming change where production happens. but it did not change who holds power. Next slide, please. And this is where my contribution comes in. It's to explain why this interdependence persists. Asymmetric interdependence from an international level from the report is not accidental. It is produced through political and institutional processes. Chinese capital aligns with domestic elites, central ministries, state-owned enterprises, and local governments that benefit from speed, scale, and the visibility of industrialization. Now, once the coalitions form, Chinese investments become institutionally embedded. It becomes difficult. It becomes now part of the development authority, the policy discretion, and how political credit is organized. In other words, it becomes super difficult to sort of replace this Chinese capital as an investor, as a development financer in Indonesia, because you're now embedded in the system. And this is why Western ideas of like, yeah, let's put in more money, let's do this and let's do that. It doesn't make sense. Not because people are not interested, and not because there's no money, but because the institutions simply don't align, the elite incentives don't align as well. Something to think about for future reports and for academics such as my wonderful co-author Angela to think about would be how does asymmetric interdependence, how does it like embed itself domestically in terms of Indonesia's democracy? Because you would have different forms of, let's say, democratic participation and mobilization across different countries. Indonesia is different from the Philippines. Philippines is different from Peru, etc., etc., etc. Next slide, please. And this would be, I think, my final slide before I pass it on. Or maybe this is not the final slide. I honestly don't remember. But the other thing I appreciate that I really like about the report is that climate narrative's legitimate concentration. China is framed as indispensable to energy transition, especially for countries that need speed, scale, and financing. That framing, in other words, normalizes dependence and narrows perceived alternatives to China. Now, domestically, what my contribution would be, or what my research has showed, is that interdependence is spatially organized. Peripheral regions absorb environmental damage, labor risk, intensity, carbon intensity, social conflict. These are not anomalies. These are structural features of the system that is optimized for cost and speed. In an article I wrote for New America, I call this the Jakarta model. Sacrifice zones sustain industrial output, while the value and political credit are concentrated amongst national elites and central institutions. The result then is not just asymmetric interdependence at the international level, but durable dependence between the peripheral zones and the benefiting core metropolis within Indonesia. The cost and benefits of the green transition are unevenly distributed and politically linked. And this for me is where I'm going to end. The report is wonderful. It shows that asymmetric interdependence exists. My research shows how this is legitimized, spatialized, and reproduced through elite power, and how it is manifested domestically. Thank you very much.
Alvin, that's all very good feedbacks, and also point out the further direction we want to work with you, especially in the future. Especially you point out, which I also love, is about the implication of all these Chinese investment, because we're not saying that all this money is back, or why the Indonesia government is not aware of this kind of a risk of over dependency on China. It's about how this money actually invested in or pouring into the same interest group. As you point out, the powerful domestic actors, ministries, ministers, political elites, state-owned enterprises, all these things, we also identify this as a very important thing, and we need to better describe and to further identify the risk of such an over-dependency might lead to a further political dependency as well. So, I mean, this is all very good, and thank you for that, Alvin. And now, if I may, I would like to turn to Angela. Would you please share your feedback? And I know you also have slides, so just let me know when you wanted to move to the next one.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks to DSET and particularly to Elizabeth and Thayin for this invitation to share about my research and how it connects to this very insightful report. Next. So the topic of nickel development in Indonesia has been one of the core aspects of my research, simply because, as it's been already mentioned, this is where the largest amount of Chinese greenfield investments have flowed in the context of Southeast Asia after the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the main point here is the report report shows why China's green ambitions rely on critical minerals. And my research is more about how this strategy has played out more from the Indonesian side, and above all, at what cost. So I would say it's very complementary, and I learned a lot from this report. It's a great update on the new dynamics of industrial development in Indonesia. I've learned about this Pamala industrial park that I didn't know about, that is being branded as green. So next. So looking at Indonesia, the idea to promote this mineral value-added processing and move away from the export of raw commodity actually was started by Yudhoyono, but was really President Widodo, who was elected in 2014, who realized this idea by these two main strategies. The export of, the ban on the export of raw nickel in 2014. And also he really leveraged the Belt and Road Initiative and the opportunities for Chinese companies to go out and invest to fulfill this objective. Next. So this table essentially shows what happened as a result of this policy, is that the exports of raw nickel that you see in the green bars basically dropped in 2014. And they were replaced not long after by the exports of stainless steel. And in the orange part of the chart, like you see how much of this went to China. So this is like, we're talking about 70 to 90% of all the exports. Next. This chart is more about the investment picture, and we're looking at China being the blue part of the bar, and you can see how investments from China became very prominent right after the Belt and Road Initiative. And the first part of these investments were really about stainless steel manufacturing, but then after 2018 they started to move and build these new hydrometallurgic processes to obtain higher grades of nickel that is being used for electric vehicles battery manufacturing. Next. So in this other slide, I wanted to focus your attention on the chart on the bottom left, and where you see actually how the Indonesian plants have been built at, with a third of the time and a third of the cost when compared to Australian or Filipino plants. And this has obvious repercussion, on their effects, especially on the environment, which next transitions us very well into the type of effects that my research has covered. Next. So here I wanted to show you just how this Morowali industrial park grew out of nothing in the last 20 years. So you see in 2022, it was just green land. Next. And you can see how this is more of a zoom out in the post-COVID time. So it's like 2018, then bottom right is 2020, and then up right is 2025, like how much this park has spiked, in terms of development in the last few years. And this is just because of the new HPAL plants that have been built. Next. And this has gone, hand in hand with the coal power plants, which you can see, spread all across Indonesia now, and they are very large coal power plants. Next. And these coal power plants have obvious repercussion on health. So mortality rate as a result will also spike. Next. And moreover, my research and several reports have flagged how these investments have ultimately led to a rise in corruption and illegality connected to mining. Next. And many labor issues related to unequal treatment of Chinese and Indonesian workers, but also exploitation. Next. And what is even more concerning are the rising number of work accidents, which have skyrocketed. And this is also because Indonesia was always had several issues related to health and safety on the workplace. But these industrial parks have very much accelerated this trend. Next. And obviously, what I saw when I went to visit these parks is also a lot of environmental effects, so a lot of deforestation. And this report has showed also how a lot of the forests that are being cleared for new mining sites are also very carbon stock. So we are really harming a lot of carbon sinks. Next. And this has obvious repercussion also like for soil and water contamination, which also has repercussion on livelihoods. So this was my final slide where I wanted to look back at the global picture, right? Like, so why are we doing this? Like, if in the global context, we are looking at EV as the solution to climate change, but as a result of producing EVs, we are basically like producing all of these side effects. You know, my research also and the report both speak to the narrative of like how, you know, these new developments are creating these sacrificial zones and how all of this is really, you know, not so sustainable and not very green either. And with this, I thank you for listening and also welcome, you know, the question that you may have next. Thank you.
All these are very good slides, and to show further and to also align a little bit on what Alvin just said about the hidden costs of the Jakarta model, right? And I also love all these satellite images that we actually see how that changed the landscape. And also all these environmental deforestation and labor issues that you lay out, all these are very important things, which we don't have the space and to actually address it in our current report, but we definitely would love to delve into that discussion further with you and Alvin in the future. So thank you all that for your insights sharing. And now, if I may, I would like to turn to Ian, please. I know you don't have slides, so I'll just leave that to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Saying. Well, congratulations on an excellent report, and the case study approach to Indonesia illustrates the issue very starkly. And to Alvin and Angela, thank you too for your excellent research, and I look forward to reading more in more detail. I'm going to zoom out and look at the whole context for the growth of China's critical minerals dominance, and what like-minded nations are seeking to do to develop alternative and more sustainable supply chains. Because one of the problems that's been highlighted, particularly by Angela's presentation, is the very poor sustainability outcomes. So the growth of China's critical minerals dominance hasn't happened overnight. It's been built up very deliberately over several decades. Indeed, until 2010, the rest of the world outside China was essentially oblivious to what was happening and was in some ways facilitating centralization of supply chain control to China and China-linked overseas investments. Now, Japan, as we know, was the first to awaken after its rare earth supply from China was cut off because of a maritime dispute. That was an existential crisis for Japanese manufacturing. But it took the rest of the industrialized world really until the early 2020s to really wake up and realize what was happening and start to take action. So the industrialized world outside China, with the exception, I think, of Japan, is a long way behind, even behind in some respects where it was 15 or 20 years ago due to loss of processing capacity and technical capability to Japan. So some manufacturing nations actually exported, for example, magnet technology to China, and China's now restricting the re-export of that technology, magnets made from rare earth elements in particular. Just an observation, China's pivot in foreign investment in metallic minerals from Australia, as we saw in the up to a decade ago, to Southeast Asia, in part has been driven by lower costs, including transaction costs of minerals development in the ASEAN region. But for the ASEAN region, and in this case study, Indonesia, that has some particular long-term costs. There's also in Australia been a fairly recent tightening in the last decade of Australia's foreign investment rules in the face of economic coercion and market manipulation that harm the economic and strategic interests of Australia. I'm not necessarily saying there's been economic coercion or market manipulation in China's investment in the Indonesian nickel industry, but the impact on Australia has been essentially to shut down the Australian nickel industry and centralise China's control. And Australia was a major nickel producer before Indonesia came along with its laterite minerals development. Now, what have other nations been doing about this? Well, they've beaten a path to Australia to try to assure supply of minerals. That has helped make Australia less dependent on investment from China, which it very much has been in the past, for minerals development. But still, incredibly, around 53% by value of Australia's raw minerals exports go to China. I'm talking about raw minerals rather than metals, so concentrates, outputs from primary processing like spodumene made from lithium to go into Chinese refineries to make lithium hydroxide for battery manufacture. 21% of Australia's raw minerals output goes to Japan and the Republic of Korea combined. So China is well over double the combined market of Japan and Republic of Korea for raw minerals. So Australia can't do without China as a minerals market, but it, like the United States, for example, as a major minerals consumer, Australia as being very dependent on China to take its mineral products needs to diversify to reduce risk. And as the report notes, Southeast Asian nations also realise that they need to diversify their markets for both investment and mineral sales, and they are moving quite fast. I've been working with them to engage with investors, financiers, and off-takers from around the world. But it's difficult in the face of market manipulation and economic coercion, in which tools that China uses to hold out other producers. And companies operating in free market economies and that are not state-backed, by and large, are very ill-equipped to cope with market manipulation and economic coercion. And many new critical minerals projects that are not China-linked but seeking to tackle supply other markets have been delayed quite severely, including rare earth elements projects. And China, rare earth elements is the field where China is probably the most dominant of all, particularly in heavy rare earths, and China, where China controls up until very recently very close to 100% of heavy rare earth production. Now, I'd just like to touch on saying, if I've got a moment, on standards-based markets as an approach. Is that okay?
Of course, of course.
Great. So in the Indonesia case study, the report highlights the problematic environmental and social costs of intensive laterite nickel production. And Angela really highlighted that in her presentation as well. And I think history is going to show, and further analysis will show, that actually Indonesia, despite its objectives, is earning quite low returns in terms of financial returns, in terms of transfer of technical capacity. The report makes that point, and in terms of economic development beyond things like infrastructure to service the industrial parks. So Indonesia is actually falling short of its objectives, and I think there is a slowly growing realisation of that, that the value being created really doesn't balance out by much the environmental and social impacts. Now, in seeking to build alternative supply chains to those that are dominated by China, the most difficult thing to achieve will be critical minerals prices that reflect the cost of producing them at higher standards. Yeah. Now, there have been multiple agreements by like-minded nations, and the report mentions the Quad. There's also, I think, the more recent G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan And they both say standards-based markets are essential, but what hasn't happened yet is how that's going to be achieved. So how do you achieve the required market prices that are sufficient to commercially compensate companies that are operating in liberal markets for the higher costs that they face by producing minerals much more sustainably? Now, Southeast Asian nations are the latest regional grouping to commit to higher sustainability standards for minerals development. And recently, in October, ASEAN launched the ASEAN Minerals Development Vision, which is a 40-year vision, the ASEAN Principles for Sustainable Minerals Development, which are now being fleshed out to be implemented across the 11 now ASEAN member states. And they also launched a 5-year cooperation action plan. We'll see how well those strategies and visions and the principles for sustainable minerals development are actually going to work in building sustainable minerals development and moving away from an overdependence on low standards. Like-minded governments such as Australia, the US, Japan, Republic of Korea, European nations, the UK, are all working with ASEAN nations, but to, if you like, counterbalance that enormous Chinese investment footprint that we've heard about, is going to be very difficult, if not impossible. That said, strong minerals governance systems will help Southeast Asian nations achieve better value, more choice in markets. And by markets, I mean for investment and for output. That's probably enough from me, and look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Always learn a lot. So especially I really appreciate your feedback from your close working experience with ASEAN countries, especially the package you just mentioned and the policy framework that aiming for the 40 years of the plan. I mean, that's all very important. And I think because I wanted to leave the audience to think about the questions as well. You can now fill in your questions through the Google Forms that we provided. But now, if I may use my privilege as a moderator, I would like to ask each of you some questions, and then you can respond, and then we can have a discussion. So as Ian just mentioned, I think the most challenging part for actually secure alternative supply chain of critical minerals, and not rare earth elements as yet, because China obviously dominated that, because they have not just about the technology itself, but also about the equipment that actually precedes all these design, and also the advantages that they have of owning all these equipment, so that we can actually very hard for us to assess all these very hard rare earth elements. But like Ian just said, I think price is the most important factor to actually have an alternative supply chain. And I would also like to point out another thing is about the location, because we cannot ask, from the consuming countries, consumers' perspective, how can we ask that each country to actually invest in very upstream sources when they actually don't have companies in the middle stream or have the products in that? And the location also matters, right? If you have the critical minerals being mined, for example, Indonesia, and you will also need the processing plants also situated in Indonesia or somewhere nearby your factory, right? So that you can further turn that into batteries and EVs, etc. So actually, my question, for example, for Alvin first, is that you also mentioned that, okay, so there are very many hidden costs for this Jakarta model. And my overall question is that, so what's your recommendation would be for Indonesia government to do more? Because we know they have already implemented a lot of policies, but due to the price and also the location and all these factors, how will you actually recommend to the Indonesia government to do more to maybe to dilute a little bit from the of the old Chinese on capitals, reliance on Chinese capitals in this supply chain?
Yeah, well, Thank you for your question. I feel like this question should be for Angela, since it is much more Indonesia specific with what she's talked about. I actually want to respond to some things to what Ian said. So in my work right now, as part of like an AI company, but also like working with the American government, with the Department of like Defense. We have to understand, I guess, like I'm going to respond to Ian generally when I talk about Chinese dominance and sort of like the market, etc. Some of the things that you basically raise as well. I think number one, China's dominance is not, in my view, it is not exactly in extraction. It is in processing. If you actually look at like minerals across the world, from lithium to nickel, etc., a lot of them are not even located in the PRC. They're actually located outside the PRC, wherein you have a PRC company or a domestic company of another country sending resources to the PRC. Best case example is the Philippines. You have a bad relationship between the Philippines and China, but 95% of Philippine nickel goes to Indonesian processing or Chinese processing, right? So basically, that's a problem. Now, what's been the reason why we haven't had a lot of investments from Western companies? That's actually the big question, right? Why is it like the West would not do it? The West has more money in terms of, let's say, you think about venture capital pool in the US is $150 billion. You have like a private equity pool of like almost more than $1 trillion. The big reason is that it's simply not profitable. It was way more profitable to invest in a tech company with a lot of low cost like in terms of starting it up. It's more expensive to invest in mining, as we all know this, right? It's a big issue. Now, what's going to change in the now? In my work, I actually work with a lot of mining companies, mostly in the West. Now, the main thing that can change for their incentive, and this is an answer to Ian more directly, the main thing that can change is that the more that China exerts geopolitical pressure on sort of the West, is the more that they actually create the conditions for Western companies to actually start investing in this alternative sources. This is actually what happened with rare earths. When there was a rare earth ban before the Busan meeting, you have shares for rare earth companies actually going up. You have the American government taking shares in like major mining companies, 5%, 10%, etc. And you have more and more money coming into the resource sector, precisely because mining companies now understand that the global supply chain is slowly bifurcating, and it is now an opportunity. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen. It is more of the conditions that we have today, simply because it was so cheap to get it from China. It was so cheap to process in China. But if geopolitics come in, it's no longer cheap, and things might change.
Yes, I wanted to point this question to both you, Alvin, and Angela. But for Angela, I have more specific one. So as we know that sustainability matters. So how can we make sure that all these mining and also processing will not have these, unbearable costs of environmental costs and labor issues to happen? But if we wanted, and we also already see that some, for example, a Canadian government or maybe Australian governments as well, they are also putting this requirement in this processing or in mining, right? But that also comes with the price. The price will be higher, and some of the government may be able to give subsidies to still that this investment happens. But how do you balance this? And what's your general suggestion to actually help to secure a sustainable but also economic feasible supply chain of critical minerals? Thank you.
Thank you, Tsai-Ing. Yes, I think it's a very difficult question to ask, because the reality is that Indonesia always had like lax environmental standards compared to China. Companies are there for profit, so they are not, so unless there are regulations to respect and there is enough monitoring, then their job is just to do business. And so all these checks and balances, like for instance, also the EIA regulations, they've actually become more lax. They were already just rubber stamping, but they've been removed also to make investments more conducive. And I mean, if you think about all the, there is an incredible amount of smelter plants that have been built. And this is already producing overcapacity. So it doesn't even make sense economically. And the Indonesian government was thinking of a moratorium, but it hasn't really implemented it. So even on the economic front, Indonesia is really not taking steps. So it's really like a difficult question. And I remember the role of, like, for instance, Elon Musk, like Tesla was like courted by Indonesia very openly for a very long time. And then suddenly he said, no, well, we are too concerned about the environmental outcomes. So the role of like, when an investor that is, very much wanted in the country gives a statement like that, it makes actually sense, and it basically has repercussions on a lot of different outcomes, because you basically want certain types of investments, but you cannot get them then. And that's quite interesting to me. And I also wanted to go and comment on Ian's bigger picture. I think what I'm seeing, is also like a worrying trend of like how Indonesia is setting an example for other countries. So for instance, like Malaysia has just announced, how many $1 billion worth of rare earths they have. And they are actively looking for new investors to basically leverage all of these critical minerals. And we are looking at deep sea mining in areas that are very, they should be conservation areas. So all of this is like really having a lot of repercussions that will not ultimately lead to the goal of like fighting climate change. And in my view, the solution to this is really like to look into different types of technologies that reduce mineral intensity, and try to avoid this like, race to getting minerals, at any cost, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. So now, Ian, final, but we need to make the question and answers short. So Ian, my question for you is that although Alvin and Angela also comment and give you some feedback about your general picture, but my personal wondering was that because ASEAN partnership, these are also, there are many countries in the ASEAN region. And how do you actually reach, what's your policy toward recommendation for each of the different countries in and to the Asian partners, and to actually to try to secure or to at least decrease to secure this sustainable supply chain of critical minerals, if you may?
Thanks, Ian. Look, I think I mentioned these long-term or the ASEAN Minerals Development Vision, the Principles for Sustainable Minerals Development, and the 5-year Cooperation Action Plan, and that's a rolling 5-year plan. Those provide a foundation of agreed approaches, minimum standards, and they are agreed at least up to the minerals minister level. And the vision has been endorsed by ASEAN leaders, so the presidents and prime ministers of the 11 ASEAN countries. That's a good start. And the standards that they set out, and the approaches and the monitoring and evaluation systems, which we're designing at the moment, plus incentive systems for corporate good behaviour, also being designed at the moment, should provide a platform on which to build. But we need to recognise that ASEAN member states are, in overall economic development terms, are at very different stages. There's a bit of conflict involved in some countries and between two of them, and that in certain cases, and Angela's just highlighted one, some of the performance and some of the regulatory settings have actually gone backwards. So there's quite a way to go, but at least ASEAN as a whole is trying, and they're going to need support from non-China, well, from China, to be frank, but also non-China actors to build much more sustainability into their minerals production systems, and also demonstrate that they're very competitive locations for downstream processing as well.
Okay, thank you, Ian. That's so very good. So finally, we only have 2 minutes left. I would like to have Eating to have one final sentence to say a little bit. So we already know that our reports is exploratory one, and we wanted to also highlight and identify the financial pattern first. But how do you see how this might be replicated to all the countries, and what's our major message to all these resource abundant countries from our report? Eating, one sentence.
Okay, I think this is a exploring research for us to on this topic, and we publish this topic and research. Put a lot of time to look into the Indonesia nickel supply chain. That's because we want to know what is the risk of over reliance on Chinese technology and capital and market demand. So, I hope that the replication we want to point out is that the over reliance on China, it will get the Indonesia in the nickel supply chain or nickel industry will get less little revenue from this situation. So if in the future we can collaborate with more researcher and our distinguished panelists, and we can explore more case study in the future. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Yiting. So now I would like to ask all our panelists and to stay still for a screenshot from our PR team. They wanted to have for everyone to look at the camera and to have this. So 5 seconds. Okay. Okay, good. Thank you. So that concludes our webinar today. And thank you all really very much for all your insights that shared with us in this webinar. And our report is now publicly available on DSET website and via the QR code I'm showing here. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or would like to continue the discussion with us. Thank you all again, and happy holidays to our partners abroad and friends in this webinar today. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Okay. I'll end the call.
Yes.